Okay, hello. My name is Michael Jury. I am an attorney and founder of AiPHELION. Today we have with us Graham Lovelace, the wonderful AI journalist, and we're very pleased to have him with us. Uh, with no further ado, I'll pass you over to Graham.
Well, thanks very much for having me, both in this very short podcast, Michael, but also on the advisory board at AiPHELION. It's perfect timing. There's so much going on out there, isn't there?
There really is. Yeah, it's a very exciting time to be in this arena. So I think we've hit the timing right. I think you came in focusing on AI before we did. So yes, here we are today. And thank you so much for being part of our board.
That's a pleasure. Yeah, I've been looking at this in anger for probably about 2.5 years now, and writing about it, speaking about it on stage, advising clients as well. Um, the take that I have, Michael, is very much that around generative AI. So the bulk of this conversation is going to be clearly talking about generative AI. Obviously, the technology, it was launched within ChatGPT from November 2022 onwards. Um, my take is that there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot that's good about it. There's a lot that can really help organizations and people in their professions, but that it comes with a series of warnings that there are some really, really big risks and major threats, which we'll probably come on to in the conversation. And what I'm about and what my Substack newsletter, Charting Gen AI, is all about is giving people that information, because they're being fed this narrative from big tech, the major Silicon Valley players behind generative AI, that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. When in fact, as I hinted at just before, there's a lot of issues. We'll come on to those.
Well, absolutely. And just mentioning your Substack, I'm a subscriber. It is absolutely fantastic. A real
Thank
sort
you.
of fountain of knowledge there. So just going back into your history a little, could you tell us a bit about how you got into journalism?
Yeah, well, that's a great way to kick off, isn't it? So it's a long time ago. I'm a lot older than I probably look. So 41 years ago, I entered proper journalism as a trainee on local newspapers here in the UK. That was a very, very traditional route to get to what used to be called Fleet Street journalism. So Fleet Street was a major, famous centre of British journalism. There was a street in London, there still is, called Fleet Street, but that's where all the major newspapers were located. So I started off on local newspapers, and we're talking sleepy rural weekly newspapers as well as urban evening newspapers as well. Um, and the training scheme that I went on, it comprised really, you got a very, very deep understanding of what you can and can't write as a journalist. So there's a lot of specific laws, particularly here in the UK, which journalists have to abide by in terms of reporting. Now, they're sometimes seen as reporting restrictions as a negative thing, but they're very much sort of cultural. They're very much of our zeitgeist here in the UK, that, for instance, we're not allowed to interview jurors as you are in the States, not allowed to identify jurors. You're not even allowed to take any photographs near a court, for instance. So there's a lot of things you've got to learn, particularly around libel and what you can and can't say to stay on the right side of a libel action. Um, and also we learned a lot about government, how that works at the national level and at the local level. And as a journalist, that really fascinated me. So I did my articled apprenticeship in journalism for 3 years, working on local newspapers. And then I got a job at the age of 24, working in Parliament for the Press Association, reporting debates. So that was about 1987, 1988. That was an amazing time. So Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. It's an amazing experience. There weren't cameras in the House of Commons in those days. So working as a press association, there were several of us, probably about 20 of us, reporting debates. Whenever there was an MP on the floor in the House of Commons, there had to be a press association journalist. And we were reporting those debates, and occasionally we got to meet and interview all the leading players, essentially, on both the government side and the opposition side. So that gave me a really, really deep grounding in journalism at the sort of national level as well. And I then made a sideways move into television, reporting a particular piece of legislation through the House of Commons as the parliamentary reporter for a programme on Channel 4 here in the UK. Then I joined the news broadcaster in the UK called ITN, Independent Television News. They produce the news services for ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5, the major commercial networks here in the UK. And I was there for nearly 4 years. I then joined a startup called BSB News. I was the one of the duty editors that merged with Sky News. It didn't work out too well for the people on the BSB end of that. We all lost our jobs after 8 glorious months. But I then went on to work for what is now called Reuters Television. And then I did a sideways move into the BBC. BBC had a stake in the company I was working for. And that was working for what even then was actually quite a primitive technology called teletext. So teletext was a information service, a live information service on TVs. Nearly half the homes in the UK at that time had a teletext television. And CFAX was the BBC service, and there was a service that was run by ITV and Channel 4. In 1992, a franchise came up for auction to run the commercial teletext service on ITV and Channel 4. And I joined that company. I became the editor-in-chief of that. And I was there, I launched that service in 93 and was there through to 1999. So going from that sort of bedrock of quite sleepy journalism, you might look at it into the rural newspapers, but I'll tell you it's the hardest and most truest form of journalism I ever worked in, all the way through to live real-time information, which we take for granted today, but back in those days, teletext was the only medium of its kind, freely available in, as I say, over half the homes in the country by the time we got through to the mid-90s. And a number of disruptive waves were coming. So I could see that from 92 to 93, there was this newfangled thing called the World Wide Web. It was going to take off. Then we called them the online services. You may remember them: CompuServe, Prodigy, AOL, all American, all with big ambitions, particularly AOL, to run services in the UK. And then there was this far sort of wilder Wild West, which was the World Wide Web, the web itself, where essentially anyone could set up a website, and anyone could actually pretend or be a citizen journalist. And so there was this enormous sort of lowering of the entry barriers to journalism. So I saw that coming, and I very, very quickly became cast as the change agent within that company. It was owned by Philips Electronics and Associated Newspapers, the publisher of the Daily Mail. And I did everything I possibly could to position that company for the digital future. So launched one of the first live real-time news websites in the UK, 94, 95. Launched services for interactive television in the late 90s as well. And sort of bringing it up to full circle, I was there for, I'd say, through to 1999, and I wanted to basically run my own thing. And the company I was working for sent me on a course at Harvard Business School, the advanced management program. That was brilliant, fantastic experience. It's about 6 months out of my schedule. And I came back and I basically did what you shouldn't do. I set up my own business, and I was helping companies that I had essentially grown up with throughout the 90s and make sense of this whole convergence piece, particularly around content, but also the distribution side of it as well. Dot-com bubble burst in early 2000, but then quickly people started talking about interactive television and TV-based services. And there was enough there for a consultancy and a small publishing business on the side, telling senior people what had happened in the previous 24 hours. That publishing business took off more than the consulting side, and I was able to sell that in 2004. And I sold that to the Press Association. So the PA, even when I was at Teletext, they had a massive contract to do all our news and racing and financial services. PA has been a major part in my career 3 times. But essentially, I sold that business in 2005, almost to the present day. I've been running my own thing again, but really looking at the disruptive waves, what's coming down the tracks, what's the future of media, what's the future of television, what's the future of newspapers, etc. And that's what got me to write 2 years ago about generative AI, which we thought the web was going to be disruptive, but my God, this is something completely different.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just back to your point on citizen journalists. Now we have, many citizen journalists enhanced by tech using social media. Nuts and bolts, what makes a superb journalist, and how do we ensure that we have more of them in the future?
That's a great question, and I'll come to the second part because it's actually quite worrying. So, what makes a great journalist? You've got to be curious. You've got to have this sort of constant gnawing thing inside you to say, what is new? How does that work? What does that mean? What is he saying? Is it true? All of those questions, you've got to constantly be thinking that way, asking lots and lots of questions in your own head before you even start to think about what's the story. Never take anything at face value. Always dig below the surface. The second thing then is getting the facts and actually getting to the truth. And that's where in television, it's called news gathering. Yeah, it's the armies of people, of news agencies and reporters in the field, actually getting out there and understanding what's really happened, eyewitness testimony, getting interviews with people, and then separating the wheat from the chaff, and then starting to build that narrative. So what is the story? How are you going to grab people's attention? In teletext, we had 3 paragraphs on the page, just 3 paragraphs, 45 words. We had to do that, in a nanosecond. We had to get that story across in about 12 to 15 words, an incredible skill once you got it right. But it's no different than if you're writing a 2,000 word essay. You still got to grab people right at the beginning. We call that an introduction or the intro, and that is absolutely fundamental. But we learned all of that back in my journalism training days, which brings me on to training of journalism. I was very lucky 40 years ago that the UK and many parts of the world, particularly America as well, had a vibrant local media ecosystem. And the local newspaper was the absolute sort of pinnacle of that. It kept everything together. It reported the local court cases, it reported local, we call them council meetings, but whatever the equivalent they call them in the States, around towns and cities. We were a check, we were a balance, we were keeping that sort of democratic process alive. Citizens need a strong flow of free, high quality information in order to actually understand what's going on around them. But certainly when they're coming to make decisions about politics. So democracies need free information. Now, what's happened over the past decades, it was even starting to happen when I was on my local newspaper days, for a whole series of largely self-inflicted wounds. Local newspaper groups around the world, particularly in the UK and the US, allowed classified advertising, absolute bedrock of the business model for local newspapers. They allowed that to go to rivals on the internet. So once they'd lost that cash cow, and they didn't initially think even subscriptions, they were just giving everything away, their business models were hollowed out. And in the cost cutting, training more or less hasn't disappeared, but it's become much smaller. And as local newspapers have died, thousands of local newspapers have died across those two territories, US and UK. It has left democratic deficits. It's left entire deserts where there are no professional journalists reporting those council meetings, reporting those court cases, understanding what's going on in those communities and providing that check. And I'm very worried about the future of that. And it comes back to AI as well. One of the ways that some players think that they can fill that gap is to essentially run a series of court press releases through generative AI. And hey presto, there's a court summary of what went on. Unless you're in that courtroom, unless you actually see that defendant, unless you actually hear what the attorneys from both sides are saying, and you actually get that color. You as the journalist, you're looking at the jury in the eye. You're looking at the defendant, yeah. And unless you've got that extra information, you don't know if anything's wrong. And this is the biggest issue that I have with generative AI. Obviously, it is riddled with inaccuracies, and we need proper journalists at that local level to counteract the slop that is gradually filling our local media ecosystems.
Thank you. So what do you think can be done now? I mean, it seems like the tide has gone so far down this route. And as you say, local media has been gutted and advertising streams just aren't there. What can be done now?
There's been lots of attempts to try and think that. So it started off with search, obviously, because search was the first real means to monetize classified advertising through pay-per-click and largely through the Google advertising model. But there were other models before that, like Craigslist in the US. Um, the thought was several years ago that the large platforms, the large players like Google, should pay some sort of local news levy, that they should help local news ecosystems because after all, they're feeding off that local content. They're taking the story, they're creating a 12, 20 word précis, and they're selling advertising around it, but none of that goes to the newspaper groups. And even more worryingly as well is that in local advertising markets as well, Google gets that attribution. So when you actually do click on something, you go through to a car dealership and you go along to the car dealer and the car dealer says, well, how did you find out about us? So I think I clicked on Google. When in fact it was the local, the only reason why that car dealer is known is that for decades and decades, it had been advertising in its local media to build a brand. So it's very, very quickly being hollowed out. Now, there are conversations starting to happen now about with AI summaries, which are now starting to enter search. And that is probably going to be the most disruptive application of generative AI that we will see over the next 3 to 5 years as search goes generative. There are those conversations again, and it's starting to come through sort of policy making circles. And that is that how are we going to fund this? How are these large AI companies actually going to pay back? Because they have scraped the world's intellectual property, they've scraped all the content, and they've given essentially nothing back. Now there are some licensing deals out there, so it's not totally nothing. But players like OpenAI, they're picking off, 3 to 5 players per country, and back to local media. They're just not big enough, and yet they're essential for that local news element. So, will we see policymakers around the world actually say, "Look, we need this content. This needs to be high quality, trustworthy, and you need to pay for it, and you need to directly help the media groups to do this." Now, it doesn't really sound a flyer in Trump's America, but in Europe, these conversations have been taken very seriously, and certainly in places like Australia as well, that they're taken extremely seriously. This idea that the AIs, that the big tech will directly fund the future of media.
So, a lot of people are raising the fact that with Gen AI, we see mistakes, we see hallucinations. Do you see there being some sort of market-driven swing back to trusted, verified journalism, very human-driven?
I do, and I think this is one of the things that media groups around the world need to really start to embrace, and that is to be the antidote to all of that slop, all of that unreliable information. Media groups have platforms still, and they have the ability to actually still provide that highly trusted content that, especially on the real time, the live information. Now, the good news is that the AI companies know this. So a lot of the large language models have been trained up to a certain point in history. So they look backwards, they're stuck in time, and they augment that with a feed of live information, essentially by scraping the web. It's called reinforced augmented generation, or RAG. The RAG deals, we haven't actually seen we're starting to see some deals, and they're not really saying exactly what they're about. But I think that what's going on now is we're starting to see some AI deals which are topping up. It's giving the AI companies that live information, and they are paying for it. And they're starting to, even Google's realizing they're going to have to start paying for this. So they've done deals recently in Australia to do exactly this, to provide that live level of information for Gemini, for instance, for their chatbots. So there is a silver lining, hopefully. It's just that we need everything. We need, societies need a pluralistic approach to this. They can't just be one player. So even in Australia, it's the Australian Associated Press, a fantastic uh, news agency. But wouldn't it be great if it was the whole of the whole of media in Australia that so you had all those voices, you had a range of voices and not just one big player.
Got it. Got it. So one of the reasons we founded this business, Aphelion, was to help clients stay on top of AI and Gen AI specifically. Um, there's so much to get through to synthesize on a daily basis. How do you cope with that information flow? What's your methodology? And
What's
what
the
do you
secret
read?
sauce? Yeah, I can't reveal it, obviously. But it's no big secret. So it's the same sort of process that I had when I was doing the newsletter that I launched, that I sold to the Press Association. And that was launched in 2000. So it's the same sort of process where I subscribe to lots and lots and lots of other people's newsletters. I have various alerts. I go through hundreds of these emails that I receive a week. Everything is humanly sifted. I've used no AI in any of this because I'm too worried it's going to miss something. And through the course of the week, I create a very, very large Word document, which can get to about 160 pages long, of just stories and links and the occasional sort of 4 or 5 paragraphs. And I will then sort of come midweek, I'll decide, right, what are the stories I'm really going to focus on for the weekly newsletter, which goes out on a Friday. And I always, always, always embellish that with real commentaries and my own pithy analysis. But I always reach out as well to key players to get their voices and their analysis as well. And many of those people are at the coalface of the companies that I'm talking about as well, be it around AI regulations. So I've actually got lawmakers that are very, very good contacts, people in the policy making spheres, that sort of thing. Um, and so I go through all this information and I'm trying to give people a feel for the major stories that have happened during the week. So I've got a way of sort of saying, and also this week these things happen, but there's like two big essays a week, and then three other major developments, which I give a bit more. I go deeper than just a line or two, and then because I'm trying to create something which is a full experience, I always try and finish up on a lighter story as well, and finally a sideways glance at something which generally is something about, yet again, a lawyer in court who has used generative AI to research their brief. And guess what? The brief is riddled with made up company names,
Yeah.
case studies, and other cases that just don't exist, And as you know, lawyers in the States are, I don't think we've had one being struck off yet, but they're being fined and they're being disciplined now. And there has been a warning in the High Court in London that if the barristers and those that are producing the briefs here as well, there's going to be some very, very serious consequences. It just makes me wonder, of course, in court cases, there's huge scrutiny over all that paperwork. And in other industries, there may not be that scrutiny. So God knows the mistakes that are getting through,
Right. What's
which
through?
aren't being challenged.
Hmm. Absolutely. So on assimilating all of that information, um, there must have been a point, or maybe there wasn't, but was there a point where there was something that you read, saw, or heard where you thought, oh goodness, the impact of AI is going to be huge and profound? Do you recall what that was?
Yes, it was my first encounter with what was then called Google Bard, and it's now Google Gemini. So that would have been a couple of years ago. And one of my clients put me onto it and said, I was doing some writing for them. And at the end of it, they said, you could have used Google Bard. And I pretended I knew what it was. And when I did actually look at it, oh my God, within a nanosecond, it was, what on earth are we going to do? This thing could actually compose text. It made a fairly good go at something I gave it. This is the very first time I used it. And then I started to test it, and then I could see how it worked. And then I realized it's an illusion. It's a magician's conjuring trick. Um, and when you then start to query it as well and say, have you got a bit more information on that? Or can you give me that in 500 words or 300 words or whatever it might be? More or less the same thing came back. It wasn't going into any greater detail. I could spot where it got some. In those days, there was no citation links at all, but I could spot where, for some stories, there's only one source, so I knew where it's coming from. And I suddenly realised, okay, that's been scraped, that's been copied. This is a lift, as we'd call it in journalism, um, and you can't do that. And that's when the alarm bell went off in my mind. So this is all pretty quickly after my first encounter that this was problematic. This was going to cause a lot of problems for mainstream media if they didn't start to challenge, assert copyright and challenge this robustly. And also for those people using it as well who don't know that paragraph 5 of a 20 paragraph output is a verbatim regurgitation from a copyrighted source. They're not going to know. And we have had stories, incidents where journalists have used this to embellish quotes, fabricate quotes. There's a newspaper in the States where a local newspaper reporter was using generative AI for weeks to make up local public quotes or local public figures. No one spotted, not even those public figures, who
Right.
probably felt they suddenly sounded much better than they did, than they really were. Um, and but it took a rival newspaper reporter to actually say that didn't happen, or that sounds a bit off. And that's my worry, that a generation growing up believing everything they see on TikTok or even everything they see on their mobile phone, they won't know that this isn't right. They won't have the digital literacy or the AI literacy to understand that actually I do need some sources here. I need to double check this. This is really important. It's a really interesting thing that I read a lot of research cases where it basically says that generative AI is just not ready for prime time in the medical sphere. So why on earth are we using this in schools? Why on earth are we using this in anything where people are producing documents which they have to rely on? It's crazy.
So on schools, I know you're a school governor as well, somehow fitting that in amongst all of the other things that you do. Um, how and should AI at all be incorporated into schools?
It's a massive debate, and there's a lot going on, I know, in America where particularly at the senior, but also at the sort of university level, what we would call here further education or higher education, um, where institutions have, happily probably had to receive large grants from the large big tech companies to roll out products. And there's been this big embrace without a real understanding of what the downside could be. And this is really, really worrying. So students are being given generative tools, generative products, um, and hey presto, they're using it to cheat. They're using it to write their essays. Now, that could lead to a return in the States to more essay-based assessments. The school where I'm a governor is at the junior level, so it's children aged between 8 and 11. But even in our setting, the government here in the UK, they've signed big AI deals, and one or two of those are directly linked to education. And the language, yet again, is all part of this. Um, it will save teachers time. It will help them mark books. It will help them set lessons. No, it won't. It won't help them mark books. It will not, it won't pick up and point to certain pupils that are struggling. It will spot patterns, but it won't give you that one-on-one sense that this teacher really knows what this child is trying to do. So it's starting to permeate at even the junior school level. There's been some we haven't discussed it as a governing body, but it is something where teachers have spoken to me because they know what I do. Um, and they're starting to say, should we be using this? I went on a course and it's ever so useful. You just type in whatever it might be, Egyptian pyramids, and it's all there. Well, it's all there even if you use search, and it's guaranteed to be pretty correct. And this is the problem. It won't necessarily be pretty correct. And it comes back to AI slop. I wrote this piece for my newsletter. It's still the case. If you go to Google and click the images button and just type baby peacock and see and just check visually what you then are presented with, you will see probably half of those images are now AI generated and very, very brightly colored small birds resembling peacocks almost at the point they come out the egg. A baby peacock is dark brown and doesn't have any colored plumage whatsoever. But because someone once said, beware, this is not a baby peacock, and that's actually a bird watching publication, it elevated that in Google's organic rankings, its search rankings. And so it's there generally number one, number two position. And as a whole, and that image comes from Adobe stock. Again, as a credit worthy source. So if you're a teacher, and just say you were setting some kids, write an essay this weekend and illustrate it, use the web. You can write a story about baby birds, for instance. And if one child says, well, I'm going to write about baby peacocks, they're ever so cute. I've seen some lovely images. That child wouldn't know. And worryingly, 5 years' time, would the teacher even know? Would any of us know? This is where it starts to get really, really dangerous. What can we believe? What sources out there? Who do we believe? All that sort of stuff. And it gets even more dangerous as AI starts to fully integrate within search as well. So if you're using search, as a lot of kids are doing, they live their life in some sort of in social media. They live their lives in social media. They're querying that, and that query is now generally being handed off to an AI product. So again, it's going to surface incorrect information, slop again, which should not, it shouldn't be there. How we tidy this up is amazing. I'm researching now, and I've just done an interview with somebody who is responsible for keeping all the slop out of Wikipedia. It's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating story. Because they've got 250,000 contributors around the world and editors, and they essentially rely on human intuition to determine, is this true? Should we believe it? Is it a credit-worthy source? All that sort of stuff. But this is a site with millions, billions of pages. How are they going to continue to do that on a human level? This is a major question for our times.
Absolutely. Deeply worrying all round. And taking your own advice, I'm going to try and end on something uh, positive and hopefully amusing. You studied at Harvard. Can you do a convincing Boston accent?
I can't, but I am aware. I'm aware of certain vowel sounds that get sort of elongated and truncated. So I'm not going to attempt, Michael, honestly, because there will be people from Boston that will say, especially given the relationship in terms of where the revolution started and all that stuff. What I will say though is after 2 or 3 weeks, I had to start using a D instead of a T in general conversation just to get by. Going to a ticket stall on what we would call the underground or subway or whatever it is in Boston, and just saying, I need to get to a certain place and how much does it cost? And have someone just look at you as if you are completely from another planet. And I think I'm speaking English, and they just start understanding at all. And nine times out of 10, people were saying, what part of Australia are you from?
Well, Graham Lovelace, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate
That's a
it.
pleasure.
Okay, thank you.